so we can get to the most enjoyable part of the evening, and that is our speaker. And I think the turnout is very much a reflection of how well known our speaker has been in the community history, South Australian history movement for a very long time. The speaker, of course, is Dr. Leith Macgillivray. Leith gave me a few notes about her, and I said I probably thought I could think of a few things to say about her, and she looked a little bit worried. But I can assure Leith they would only be very good and very positive things. Of course, she spent most of her life involved in education. She's had, if she doesn't mind me saying it, a reasonably exotic career. She's taught in secondary schools in South Australia. That's not that exotic. But in an international school and with Tibetan refugees in India, and as an Australian volunteer in a teachers' college in the Western Highlands of Papua New Guinea. Before her retirement, how long since you retired, Leith? Oh God, we're all getting old. It's a longer than I realised. Before her retirement about 6 years ago, she was an education officer and an archives research officer in the Mortlock collections of the State Library, where many of you would have met her and experienced her enthusiasm for South Australian history. She's written a number of articles over the years and contributed a great deal to knowledge of South Australian history. She's here tonight to talk about a project that she's been working on since retirement. I think you started after retirement on this project, dealing with the women who came to South Australia in the first few years of settlement. Well, she's here tonight to talk to us about A Worthy Sisterhood, Pictures of Birth, Death and Marriage from among the founding mothers of 1836. Would you please make welcome Dr. Leith Macgillivray.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much for coming. It's lovely to see such a large audience. Now, Rob, with your permission, tomorrow is a very big voting day, and I think we might get in the right frame of mind if I asked you, might I give a brief preamble, please? This is my preamble. I had hoped to be able to show several slides, but the era I'm speaking about, as you know, is the 1830s, where what is available are sketches and drawings, and they don't reproduce well. So I'm only going to have those two slides, but I'd like you to look carefully at this one, and if you can't see it well now, I hope you might come and have a look later. It's by a pre-Raphaelite painter called Ford Madox Brown, and it's entitled The Last of England. If you look closely later, you'll notice the white cliffs of Dover receding in the background. The little skiff you can't see from there, but it's named El Dorado. Around the front you'll notice some cabbages hanging. You will also see that the man is sheltering the woman with an umbrella. In the background there's old reprobate shaking his fist at the country he's leaving behind, and you will see lots more on a closer look afterwards. I think it's a very beautiful painting, and it was done in 1852 by Ford Madox Brown when he was thinking of emigrating. He was a penniless artist at that time, and some of his friends had already emigrated and gone to the diggings in Victoria. It's a self-portrait, the man. He's taken his own face, and it looks to me quite apprehensive, even aggressive, brooding. That's Emily, his wife, who is his model, in real life his wife, and I think she looks a bit more resigned and trusting, but you'll notice the position of their hands and just the expression on their faces. At the same time as that painting appeared, there was a verse by a man called Charles Bennett, set to music and appeared in the Illustrated News. And I'm just going to read the last verse, I should have said poem, sorry, the last verse, and I think it might capture for you what people felt when they were going half a world away with no return ticket in those days. Farewell to thee, England, O land of our birth, the pride and the glory and queen of the earth. We sail with sad hearts to a land far away, in search of the bread that may fail if we stay. New faces grow bright in the blaze of our fires. The stranger sits down in the halls of our sires. Farewell, oh farewell to thy beautiful shore. England, dear England, farewell evermore. That's my preamble. I want to talk to you now about a worthy sisterhood, pictures of birth, death and marriage from among the immigrant women to South Australia in 1836. The first women in Tandanya, later the province of South Australia, were of course Aboriginal women, countless of whom were here centuries before colonisation. But these women, I believe, deserve a separate study. Tonight, I wish to turn our attention to a few of those 117 immigrant women who arrived on the first 9 ships to reach South Australia before the 31st of December 1836, the year in which South Australia was founded as a British province. 78 adult females on board these ships were assisted immigrants, commonly referred to as the labouring class, and 39 were paying passengers known as the superior or officer gentleman class, later termed the middling class by historian Douglas Pike. In recounting stories of a few women of 1836, I've chosen as a linking theme their experiences of birth, death and marriage. On the 27th of July 1836, the Duke of York, first of the immigrant ships to arrive in South Australia, lay at anchor in Nepean Bay off Kangaroo Island. On board, gravely ill, lay Lucy Bear, 33-year-old wife of Thomas Hudson Bear, second in command of the South Australian Company. 4 of Lucy's 8 children had died at birth or in infancy. Pregnant again in 1836, Lucy had endured the rigours of a 4-month journey in the Duke of York, during which, with no surgeon to assist her, she gave birth to her 9th child. Her little unnamed daughter died and is believed to have been buried at sea. Lucy herself barely escaped death. Captain Robert Morgan, the godly captain of the Duke of York, was greatly concerned for Lucy Bear. But Captain Morgan was a man of his times. He could only describe Lucy in her grief and postnatal depression as being deranged. 5 days later, in a hastily erected tent on an isolated shore in bleak midwinter, Lucy's condition had so worsened that Captain Morgan sent for William Chadwick on board the newly arrived Lady Mary Pelham. Chadwick had had some nursing experience, but he confessed, quote, that he took such strong doses of opium for his nervous attacks, he did not often know what he was doing. Without competent medical help, Lucy fought for her life and her sanity throughout August, and only in early September could Captain Morgan rejoice that she was, quote, restored to her right mind. Within a year, Lucy Bear was pregnant with her 10th child. In another difficult birth, her little daughter Mary Ann survived, but Lucy, at only 34 years of age, died in childbed 8 days later. The widowed Thomas Bear, with 5 children to care for, married 21-year-old Lucy Bull 2 years later, and they parented 9 children. Several aspects of Lucy Bear's experiences of birth, death and marriage reflect those of early 19th century men and women. Remarriage, often an economic necessity for women, invariably followed a spouse's death. Without effective contraception, large families were a woman's lot, with midwifery often considered, quote, an occupation degrading to gentlemen. Infant mortality and the risk of death in childbed were consistently high. One feature of Lucy Bear's experience, however, was atypical of her sister immigrants in 1836. Official records or reports of death at sea in 1836 are not extant in South Australia, but according to private papers, Lucy Bear was the only immigrant woman of 1836 who lost a newborn baby at sea. Nor is there any record of a woman who died of childbirth at sea. Even allowing for non-reporting or under-reporting in private papers, in comparison with the devastating losses on later voyages, one might assume that these first immigrant women were a healthy, sturdy lot. This was especially so with regard to labouring class women. These women had access to surgeons on only 5 of the 9 immigrant ships, and these surgeons carried only minimal midwifery equipment. Furthermore, labouring class women were cooped up in steerage, in foul air, with bilge water and decaying vegetable material, an ideal breeding ground for any epidemic. Healthy, fertile, labouring women were one essential element in the systematic colonisation theories of Wakefield and his fellow planners. Upon this class, these men laid the onus of being the producers of a future labour force, which would reduce the cost and ultimately the necessity of importing immigrant labour. The women of South Australia's first fleet would seem to have conformed, at least in this respect, to the planners' aims and prospects. From the evidence available, only 2 women, both assisted immigrants, died on board ship, although not from childbirth. One of these was Elizabeth Chandler, whose encounter with death was unique. Elizabeth, with her 4 children and husband Charles, a 28-year-old ploughman from East Acton, Middlesex, engaged by the South Australian Company, left England on the 3rd of April on the John Pirrie, captained by George Martin. An unidentified seaman, probably the purser, noted in his log that Mrs. Chandler had a most violent temper which could cause her to be shockingly wicked. On the 2nd of June, Mrs. Chandler and Mrs. Powell, wife of the gardener Charles Powell, also from Acton, were engaged in a heated brawl, in which the purser claimed, quote, the most disgusting, aggravating language was used by both ladies. Charles Chandler tried in vain to pacify his wife, but with a bundle of clothes in her arms, she made toward the ship's rail, threatening to drown herself. Captain Martin caught hold of her just in time. Early next morning, the helmsman sounded the alarm for a woman overboard. Elizabeth Chandler had again, in the purser's account, quote, come up on deck with a bundle of clothes still in her arms, and in a terrible rage suddenly threw the bundle overboard that no other woman, he said, her husband might take, should have the satisfaction of wearing them after. After giving a momentary glance at her husband, she sprang overboard to the horror and amazement of all who beheld the sight. In that momentary glance, what did Elizabeth Chandler convey to her husband? Determination? Revenge? Despair? We do not know. But rescued after 10 minutes in the water, as the purser recorded, in almost a lifeless state, Mrs. Chandler was given the usual remedies for recovering the apparently drowned. Throughout July, the purser nursed his patient faithfully, tending her wounds and taking a pint of blood as advisable. One night, however, she became, quote, quite delirious, and the smell from her breath uncommonly strong and most disagreeably sickening. On the following morning, Elizabeth Chandler died. All passengers were mustered on deck to see her body committed to the deep, sewn in 3 or 4 old sacks, with a weight of iron made fast to her feet. Charles Chandler later married Harriet Clark, but should you someday climb Chandler's Hill near Clarendon, named after him, you might spare a thought for his first wife. Yet suicide was either undocumented or rare. No other 1836 woman apparently took her life, but 3 husbands on that contingent did. Ironically, one was Captain George Martin, 6 years after he had rescued Elizabeth Chandler. In a suicide note found by his daughter, George Martin, when in debt and of nervous instability, shot himself at his home in Curry Street, leaving destitute his widow, Maria, and 8 children. And Rob can tell you a lot more about George Martin's actual headstone and burial. Several women, heavily pregnant on board ship, gave birth soon after arrival. These women now faced problems additional to those of giving birth in England. They were in an unknown land and an untested environment. Among such women was Anne Finnis, immigrant on the Signet and of the officer-gentleman class as wife of Boyle Travers Finnis, soldier, surveyor, and the first Premier of South Australia. Their child, Fanny Lipson Finnis, delivered by Dr. Woodford for 3 guineas in the early hours of New Year's Day, 1837, was the first girl born in the colony. The baby and her mother spent their first days in a reed and grass hut built by Aboriginals at Rapid Bay. As Finnis recorded, Aboriginal women also nursed Fanny with all the care of a practised nurse. After 10 days, mother and child were moved to Glenelg and housed in a 12 feet diameter bell tent. Finnis tells, he found his wife one morning, quote, in a pitiable state from weakness, harassed by flies in the almost insupportable heat of the January sun. Dr. Woodford had himself thrown buckets of water on the outside of the tent to cool the atmosphere within. End of quote. Anne and Fanny Finnis survived their first Australian summer, but another trial soon followed. A chill lodged in Anne Finnis's suppurating breast. In her husband's word, this rendered a surgical operation necessary. This was a decade before ether was available in either England or South Australia. But Anne Finnis and her fellow colonists had to cope not only without anaesthetic, but also had to adapt to giving birth and enduring pain in makeshift accommodation in the unfamiliar climate of their new and alien land. In January 1831, Robert Goodger, Colonial Secretary, had submitted to the Colonial Office a plan for assisting pauper children to immigrate, which may have led to the sponsorship of 2 servants, Margaret Clark and Mary Ann Vincent, aged 15 and 16 respectively. Margaret, or Peggy, and Mary Ann excuse me, were inmates of Victoria Asylum in Chiswick, London, run by the Children's Friends Society, formerly known as the Society for the Suppression of Juvenile Vagrancy. The Society's purpose was to rescue children, quote, from a life of wretchedness and crime on London's streets, to teach them the habits of industry under the influence of moral and religious habits, end of quote. After 3 months' training, the Society considered the children fit for agricultural or domestic labour in the colonies. Many were sent to Cape Colony, South Africa, where their labour was to fill the gap made by the abolition of slavery. Western Australia was also a popular placement, but Peggy and Mary Ann were sent to South Australia on the Africaine as servants of Robert Goodger and his wife. At first the girls found favour with their mistress, but soon Peggy was in disgrace for, quote, lightness of conduct toward the sailors, for the effect of spirituous liquors, and for biting and scratching Mary Ann so mercilessly that she drew blood. Captain Duff, the steward, and Goodger agreed that Peggy's hair should be cut from one side of her head. This form of punishment was designed to humiliate and to shame, and to undermine a woman's femininity with the loss of her crowning glory. Peggy's laughter and joking throughout the whole operation may well have been a mask for that very humiliation and sense of shame. After their arrival in 1837, then 16, Peggy married Matthew Pearce, who was a grocer before going to the diggings. By 1857, they had 6 children. Mary Ann married George Thomas Elias Jones in 1838. In 1855, assumedly with Mary Ann still as his wife, Jones was a clerk in the Port Elliot railway system. Both couples then disappear from trace. We cannot speculate whether their life and marriage in South Australia offered material opportunities or even a degree of social mobility they might not have had in England, but this we do know. Peggy and Mary Ann were forerunners of those thousands of young people in the 19th and 20th century who were part of England's industry of exporting labour to the colonies, as so recently and poignantly portrayed in the TV series The Leaving of Liverpool. Many became, quote, lost children of the empire. Yet here, in South Australia, as early as 1836, we can number 2 London street kids among our founding mothers. The greatest killer in the 19th century was pulmonary consumption. Therapeutic immigration became popular, firstly because seasickness on the voyage often induced vomiting, which was believed to be curative. More importantly, South Australia was early and widely publicised as having, quote, a salubrious climate with a total absence of cold, damp fogs, and therefore of particular advantage to those suffering from pulmonary affections. Although not explicitly stated, there is every indication that Harriet, wife of Robert Goodger, left England not only 4 months pregnant, but also suffering from consumption. Her family showed great reluctance and anxiety at her departure, but she determinedly set sail with her husband on the Africaine. Harriet's journey was fraught with, quote, constant sickness, violent headaches, and serious liver and stomach symptoms. Despite his propensity to depression, Goodger was a solicitous nurse, even to making a swinging canvas cot, believed helpful for consumptives, to replace the one they had unfortunately left at home. After their arrival at Holdfast Bay in November 1836, Goodger erected an especially spacious tent. In this tent, on the 28th of December, while oaths of office were taken and the proclamation read for the first time, Harriet lay deep in labour. By 6 o'clock on the following morning, Goodger rejoiced in his diary, quote, I have given the new province a son. Harriet and Robert Goodger named their baby Henry Hindmarsh Goodger. Henry after Goodger's brother, and Hindmarsh, quote, so that his son's birth might be a matter of permanent interest in the province's history. Sadly, at any proclamation commemoration I have attended, I have not heard mention of little Henry Hindmarsh Goodger or his mother, the woman in such close proximity to that first ceremony. Nor, for that matter, have I heard mention of any other women of 1836. By mid-January, a consultation of doctors openly declared Harriet was in the advanced stages of pulmonary consumption. Neither a sea voyage nor a short time in a new environment had been of any benefit. Quote, not even hope now exists as my solace, wrote the stricken Goodger. Harriet Goodger died on the 14th of March 1837, and her little 11-week-old son 2 days later. Goodger buried his family in Town Acre 685, one of his 8 town acres bordered by King William and Gilbert Streets and South Terrace. In November 1837, Goodger returned to England, quote, to seek justice for himself and the colony, following the political turmoils of that year. In late 1838, he married his cousin Sarah Whitton before returning to South Australia. Here he found his home in utter disrepair. Quote, let to a low working man who had in turn let out every room to South Australian company tenants, wrote Goodger, they even used the cemetery of my late wife as a summer house and a sleeping room. Harriet Goodger's short-lived life in South Australia, her death, and the aftermath of her death had brought nothing but pain and grief to her and her husband. Like so many others, she was the victim of the greatest cause of death in South Australia until the 1880s. Just an aside, in 1843, when South Australian figures become more reliable, between 1843 and 1847, there were 121 reported deaths of consumption. Many, of course, may have remained unreported. Marriage was the common expectation of 19th century men and women. Insurance against loneliness, far from family and friends, made marriage even more inviting to intending immigrants. 3 labouring couples married on board the Buffalo before the vessel had left the Channel, having probably found the month's delay in departure a fortuitous time for courting. Several men of the middling class married, sometimes hurriedly, as soon as they saw opportunities opening up in the new province. One who refrained from so doing confided his misgivings to his diary on board the Buffalo. Sunday, 14th August. This day I attained the age of 30 years, therefore ceased to be a young man. An awful painful reflection, being still a bachelor, and likely continue so for some time. All's well that ends well, though. He did marry. For 19th century women, marriage was synonymous with domesticity and reproduction. Morality was also a constant theme, especially with regard to working class women. Both concepts were further elements which accorded well with the Founding Fathers' philosophies. Under their theoretical planning, morality and marriage took on a special significance. Women were, the planners argued, the moral agents in establishing stable marriages. God's police is the current term. Stable marriages led, the planners further reasoned, to settle, civilising communities without fear of dispersion or a dreaded loss of population to the other colonies, which meant a consequent loss of production and prosperity. As married women were central in serving their purposes as moral arbiters and producers of future labour, the theorists advocated that immigrants should be young married couples under 30. The 1836 contingent fell far short of this ideal, however. Of the 48 labouring class couples, only about a third were under 30. Moreover, there were 3 times as many single labouring class men as women. Yet these men and women soon seized their opportunities, and by mid-1838 the majority had married either their fellow immigrants of 1836 or those who had arrived in the following 18 months. Only 4 single middle-class women arrived in 1836, these being a widow and 3 women accustomed to living with their relatives. Among the latter were 47-year-old Anne Hindmarsh, sister of Governor John Hindmarsh, who remained a spinster, and Charlotte Bear, sister of Thomas Hudson Bear and sister-in-law of Lucy Bear. At 48, Charlotte Bear had well passed the conventional age of marriage, but she and the mercurial 27-year-old Samuel Stevens, colonial manager of the South Australian Company, had behaved so scandalously on board the Duke of York that they caused shame to their family and ridicule among the passengers. Their marriage on Kangaroo Island on the 24th of September 1836, amid much clamour and even more rum, was the first wedding to take place in the colony. Prominent citizen John Morfett commented wryly that the occasion was an amende honorable, literally an apology, but could be taken to mean that Samuel Stevens had made an honest woman of Charlotte Bear. With marriage a social convention, the younger women of this class had Victorian mothers who felt the same responsibility as the redoubtable Mrs. Bennet of Pride and Prejudice in finding suitable husbands for their eligible daughters. Susanna and John Hindmarsh had 3 daughters of marriageable age, Jane, Susan and Mary. Susan's parents found her marriage to Alfred Miller Mundy, wealthy landowner, colonial secretary, and later inheritor of Shipley Estate in Derbyshire, entirely suitable. The Hindmarshes also strongly approved of Thomas Bew Strangways, well-known promoter of the 1869 Land Act, as Jane's suitor. In the words of John Hindmarsh, Strangways was, quote, a gentleman of high feelings, of moderate wealth, and of a very old family. These were excellent credentials for a future son-in-law, but for reasons unknown, Jane remained unmarried. No marriage took place. No marriage took place. In a time when spinsterhood was a problematic situation, Jane lived with her parents, first in Helgoland and then in England. In her late 40s, she became the wife of widower John Ellis, pastoralist and benefactor of St. Peter's College. But her parents did not live to see either the suitable marriage or the comfortable retirement Jane and her husband enjoyed at Kelverton Hall, Essex. The marriage of their youngest daughter, Mary, to George Milner Stephen, first Crown Solicitor, then Advocate General, and finally acting Governor, had two hallmarks of suitability. Stephen's high and powerful connections in both England and Australia made him eminently suitable. So did his musical and artistic talents, which he shared in the evenings with the equally talented Hindmarsh sisters, and which earned him many a dinner at Government House. Yet, Stephen's appearance was generally unprepossessing. One young contemporary described him as being a dapper little man with curly hair and whiskers, small in every way. He wore ladies' number 4 in boots, and was in fact what goes by the term of a ladies' man. George Milner Stephen also had eccentric habits. He kept a pet monkey, translated Cicero, or read the life of Wilberforce before breakfast. Stephen was also intolerably vain, as confirmed by his diary jottings, 2 of which must suffice here. 2nd of February 1839. They have named a long terrace on Walkerville Estate after me! 13th of September 1839. Went to a ball given by the ladies of Adelaide to the bachelors. My health was drunk after supper with cheers! How very valuable popularity is! Eccentricity and vanity paled, however, beside George Milner Stephen's unscrupulous ventures, particularly in mining schemes and land speculation, both in South Australia and Tasmania. As a result, in 1839, Stephen faced trial for forgery and perjury. The trials were abortive, but Stephen's corruption lost him his job and he was advised to leave South Australia. Hindmarsh was one of Stephen's very few supporters. When her husband was recalled to England, Susanna Hindmarsh, then living in Halifax Street awaiting his expected return, faced the disparagement of Adelaide's prominent citizens alone. This did not deter, however, from combining her own business acumen with her son-in-law's wily skills. Together they added to Governor Hindmarsh's already prodigious profits from land sales. When she left South Australia to join her husband in his governorship of Helgoland, Susanna Hindmarsh's bank credit of £12,000 was the highest in the colony. While George Stephen followed amongst other occupations that of geologist, miniaturist painter, barrister, inventor, and public servant, Mary Stephen mothered 13 children, 4 of whom died, while travelling back and forth several times between South Australia, Helgoland, England, and New South Wales. By 1847, even Hindmarsh was admitting his son-in-law's excesses and failures, sprang from his untempered self-confidence and overweening vanity. To his daughter Susan, Hindmarsh wrote that despite all the vicissitudes of her life, her sister Mary, poor dear Mary, spirit did not flag. But neither had Mary ever, he continued, cease to build castles in the air, that one day her husband might take up a settled office. This was not to be. 30 years later, Mary Stephen was still leading a nomadic existence in the wake of a husband now become spiritualist and itinerant faith healer. Despite his faults, Jane Hindmarsh was a family man. He and Susanna were at least spared these last years of what to them, as aspiring middle-class parents, would have been far from the suitable marriage they would have wished. The title of my talk, A Worthy Sisterhood, is taken from a poem by a grandson of another woman of 1836, Mary Thomas, well-known poet and diarist. In conclusion, I should like to elevate one aspect of the worthiness of these women. I believe they are worthy to have their story told, not in slight, isolated accounts tenuously linked as I've done tonight. Following historical research in extant public, private and statistical sources in the places of origin of these women, we could one day well have their counterpart history along the line of Portia Robinson's The Women of Botany Bay, or Kay Daniels' Convict Women. At least their life and times could then be woven appropriately into future social histories of South Australia. In short, as Alan Atkinson, historian, wrote recently, history is a region thick with competing voices. The voices of these early South Australian women, as well as so many women still overlooked, are, I believe, among those competing voices. These women matter, I believe, for they too are part of the stuff of history.
You mentioned that a great many of the, or 1/3 of the women who came out, or the couples that came out, were over the age that they had originally been set. Do you know how many of those were employees of the South Australian Company?
How many of their husbands were employed by the South Australian
yes.
Company? Offhand, no. The South Australian Company tended to employ single men. Not only, I can think of some who, Mildred, for example, who was married, and yes, I can think of, say, about half a dozen who were married, but because they were starting up a new colony, they wanted certain kinds of skills, and they were mainly single men. I wouldn't think there were more than half a dozen who were married, offhand. I can think of some names, but that's not important perhaps. Just about half a dozen, I would say. Can I ask you why you were wanting to know? Is there something that leads to I could help? Some of those men and women, of course, lived on Kangaroo Island for the first couple of years until the company went fat. So they had a pretty isolated existence there too, the women.
They're always slow, but they'll come.
Leith, you've said that most women had marriage as their ambition, and in fact it was probably their main opportunity to succeed. Were there many women who didn't marry, and if so, what sort of pursuits did they follow if marriage wasn't an option?
You mean of these women I'm talking about,
yes.
don't you, John? I suppose it was their ambition in a way, but it was just also convention, really. Really, to be a spinster was a bit of a problem. Now, you asked me if they weren't married when they came, they were chosen for, again, their skills. Now, most of the women were urban women, so in particular demand were rural women. I can think of one woman who said that she was a widow, Harriet Endor Harvey. Her descendants have written her family history and said, and I agree, she had a little child with her. She probably wasn't a widow. She was probably an unmarried woman. And the reason why she'd be chosen in that state, quite likely, is because she was a dairymaid. And I didn't mention all the things that were central about women being chosen, but that was another one. Sometimes the men came only because of their wives' occupation, because they were dairymaids or straw platters or whatever, were in short demand. Now, Harriet Endor Harvey, as I said she was a widow. She did marry twice more, actually, in South Australia, both times disastrously. I'm thinking of another woman, Sarah Sanders, who was 31 when she came. Now that's fairly past marriageable age in a sense. Sarah Sanders didn't choose, as these women, most of the women did, to marry labouring class women, to marry fellow labouring class men. She was a servant for Captain Lipson at Port Adelaide, and she made the unusual marriage of marrying George Brown. George Brown was an Afro-American from New York. He was called in those days a black man or a coloured man. They had 3 children. Sarah died of influenza, and George died about 5 years later. He'd also lived on Kangarowan with Aboriginal women Sue and Sal. But I can't tell you what happened about those children and so on, but I don't know whether at 31 she felt that she was not going to marry, but the marriage seems to all accounts a very happy one. But she was a late age. Anne Hindmarsh was 47 when she came. She didn't marry. She stayed with Governor Hindmarsh all his life and is buried with him at Brighton. So I can't think of any who stayed unmarried, John. Some of them married 2 or 3 times, when their husbands died. But I think it was just convention. And as I did point out, those who lost their husbands before they married again were often destitute. And one source that you can find them is they're given rations because they are destitute. They are women who might be a servant, but they lose their husband, there's no income. So it's more or less an economic imperative as well for them. Oh yes. Yes.
Do you know did you get any figures for that?
I would say, I should have added them up actually, I would say there were roughly about 10 or 12 pregnant on board ship, and at least 6 or 8 of those gave birth on board ship too. Rosina Ferguson has left correspondence back to her parents in Scotland describing exactly how they were curtained off and secluded away, and how difficult it was for these women to give birth, especially if they were in steerage as labouring class women. And there was no privacy and no medical help. And some of the pictures you see of the instruments used in giving in midwifery are really horrendous.
No, I meant single women.
Oh, sorry, who became pregnant?
I meant single women coming out rather than married women being pregnant before they left England. Or they shipped out of the colonies
no,
to hide disgrace.
No, I didn't ever read of any, no. If it were so, that was kept a secret, but I don't think it was, because in private letters and diaries, which I've had to rely on most, for want of public sources here in Australia, let's hope there's something in the Public Record Office sometime for someone in England. No, I think there would have been some comments made, because some of those letters are quite frank. No, can't say so. By the way, could I just say, there's an exhibition at the moment, a Commonwealth travelling exhibition at the Migration Museum, which is there till November the 28th, and it's entitled A Millionth Migrant. It's the 1950s, and if you could go to see that before November the 28th, you'd get some continuity from what I've spoken and Margaret has spoken about. Margaret Kleinig has spoken about women later on, in the later part of the 19th century, and then the 1950s. It would be good to see a whole overall picture like that, and there are some wonderful photos in that exhibition.
Yes, Leith, I just wondered if you knew, were there a lot of single women came out as servants in those very early ships?
I would say servant was the most popular occupation, but then you're never quite sure what level of servant they were. And there were gradations for servants, and domestic servant is a term most often used. House servant is sometimes used, but yes, the majority would have been. But as I was saying to earlier, that some of them had very particular skills, the rural women, and they were few, as I said also. And if they had those particular skills, they were quite in demand. But on the whole, yes. Of the labouring class, of course.
Well, if that's all the questions, I'll draw this part of the evening to a close by asking our Vice President Maurice Ken if he'll say a few words of thanks.
Thank you. Well, this, as the President has mentioned, is our final lecture for the year. And we're certainly very grateful to Leith for giving us this very fully described story of the heroics of those women who came in those early days. Perhaps it might be said they were fairly foolhardy to even contemplate coming to South Australia in the conditions that they had to come. But the research work that Leith has done has given us more insight to those real heroes of the South Australian pioneer settlement, and I think that we've all gained quite an insight from the way that Leith has told us the story tonight, and we certainly appreciate what you have put into that talk and research work, and we hope that there might be some more information come available for you. And certainly if members come across information, I'm sure Leith's always willing to learn more about this particular period. She's had a great interest in the social history in South Australia, and we certainly compliment her on her work, and we thank her very, very much for coming on and giving us this talk tonight. So I'd like you to show your appreciation to her.